The bar was buzzing louder than you'd expect for a Thursday night. Our group had snagged a corner booth, and the mix of thumping music and bursts of laughter ricocheted off the walls. Across from me, Rachel sat cradling her third margarita, her gaze fixed somewhere over my shoulder like she was avoiding me on purpose. Normally, Rachel was the spark in the group, always teasing, joking, and making everyone laugh. But tonight, she seemed off, quiet, fidgeting in her seat. I couldn't ignore it. I glanced over at Vanessa, my wife. She was leaning in close to Brian, laughing at something he'd said, her hand briefly brushing his arm as she tilted her head. A flicker of annoyance pricked at me, but I quickly pushed it aside. Vanessa and Brian had been friends forever. There wasn't anything new, right? Still, Rachel's unusual behavior nagged at the edges of my mind. When I finally caught her eye, she quickly dropped her gaze, swirling her drink like it held the answer to some deep question she didn't want to ask out loud. "Rachel, you good?" "Nah." I leaned in, keeping my voice low. "You've been pretty quiet tonight." She blinked, her cheeks turning pink. Oh yeah. "Just tired, long day at work," she mumbled. But the way her words came out slow and a little too deliberate made it clear she wasn't telling the truth. Before I could press, she threw back the rest of her drink in one long gulp and muttered, "You deserve someone better, Mason." Her words hit like a sucker punch. I stared at her. "What?" My tone was sharper than I meant it to be. She froze for a second, her eyes widening slightly before she waved it off with a shaky laugh. "Forget it. Too much tequila, you know." She wobbled as she stood up. "I need some air." I stayed, planted in my seat, stunned. "You deserve someone better." What the hell was she trying to say? I glanced back at Vanessa, who was still leaning toward Brian, her attention locked on whatever he was saying. That knot in my chest tightened a little more when Rachel returned to the table. She acted like nothing had happened, smiling, chatting, but it was all surface level. I could see right through it. She kept her distance from me the rest of the night, as if she was afraid I'd bring it up again. My mind churned, but no answers came. Only questions, too many questions. My cousin Olivia, who had joined our group that night, caught my eye from across the table. She had a way of noticing things others missed, and her raised eyebrow told me she'd witnessed the entire exchange with Rachel. I gave her a subtle shrug, and she tilted her head slightly toward the exit, suggesting we talk later. When we got home, I still couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Vanessa kicked off her heels at the door and headed straight for the bedroom, tossing her purse onto the dresser. I followed her, leaning against the doorframe as she slipped into a t-shirt and shorts. "So," I started casually, "Rachel said something strange tonight." Vanessa paused for the briefest moment, not long enough for us for the briefest moment. Most people to notice, but long enough for me to catch. "Strange how?" she asked, her back still to me. She said, "I deserve someone better," I said, watching her carefully. Vanessa let out a short laugh and turned to face me. "That?" I pressed. It felt pointed. Vanessa rolled her eyes and climbed into bed, pulling the covers up around her. You know how Rachel gets after a few drinks. She probably thought she was being profound or something. "Let it go, my baby," I muttered, though I didn't believe her. The way she brushed it off so quick, so dismissive, left me uneasy. I lay beside her that night, staring up at the ceiling, the events of the evening looping in my head. Rachel's strange look, Vanessa's strange look, Vanessa's laughter with Brian, their heads too close, the way she hesitated when I brought it up. None of it added up. Beside me, Vanessa turned over, her back to me. Within minutes, her breathing slowed, steady and soft like she was asleep, or pretending soft like she was asleep. To be. The next morning, I decided I needed answers. Rachel's words hadn't come out of nowhere, I was sure of it. I sent her a quick text asking her to meet me for coffee. She took her time replying, and when she finally did, her response felt reluctant, like she was agreeing out of obligation. We picked a small cafe near her place. When I got there, she was already sitting at a corner table, gripping her latte like it was the only thing keeping her grounded. She looked up as I approached, her face pale, her eyes darting everywhere except toward me. "Rachel," I said as I slid into the seat across from her, "I need you to explain what you meant last night." Her shoulders stiffened, and she kept her gaze locked on thought, cup in her hands. "I told you, Mason. I was drunk. I didn't mean anything by it." Her excuse didn't sit right with me. "Look," I said, my tone sharper than I intended. "You don't say something like that unless there's a reason." "What?" Aren't you telling me? She shifted in her chair, her fingers tightening around the cup. She glanced around nervously, her chest rising and falling as she took a shaky breath. I didn't want to be the one to tell you. Tell me what? I asked, my voice calm but firm. Her lips quivered, and she hesitated. Vanessa's been seeing someone, she finally said, barely above a whisper. Her words slammed into me, but I forced myself to stay composed. Who? I asked, my voice low and steady. Rachel shook her head, her eyes welling up. I don't think I should. Don't play games with me, Rachel, I interrupted, my patience unraveling. If you know something, just tell me. Who is it? Her lip trembled, and for a moment, I thought she might break down entirely. Then finally, she whispered, It's someone in our group. The air left my lungs as I leaned back in my chair, my mind racing through the faces of our friends. Brian, Chris, Emily, Sarah. It was like spinning a wheel, knowing one of them was hiding something but not knowing which one. Rachel broke the silence, her words spilling out in a rush. I didn't want to get involved, Mason, I swear, but she's my friend, and I didn't know what to do. She begged me not to tell you. I clenched my fists under the table, trying to keep my composure. My voice came out low. Steady. How long has this been going on? She shifted in her seat, barely meeting my gaze. A few months, I think, she mumbled. I'm not sure. A few months. The words echoed in my mind as anger blurred my vision. All those late nights at work, the sudden need for space, the uptick in work events. It all added up now. I'd been blind, and Vanessa had used my trust as her cover. Who is it, Rachel? I repeated, my tone cold, each word sharper than the last. She shook her head, tears glistening in her eyes. I can't, Mason. Please, don't make me. I leaned in, my voice a low growl. If you don't tell me, I'll find out on my own, and when I do, I won't be as forgiving. Rachel flinched, the tears spilling over now. She grabbed her bag, fumbling as she stood. I'm sorry, Mason, she whispered, her voice cracking. Then she turned and hurried out of the cafe, leaving me alone. With my thoughts, I sat there for a long time, staring blankly at the table. Someone in our group? The words cut deeper than I wanted to admit. These were people I trusted, people I considered family. Now one of them had taken a knife to that trust, and I was left bleeding. By the time I left the cafe, I still didn't have answers, but one thing was certain, I wasn't letting this go. If Rachel wouldn't tell me, I'd uncover the truth myself, and when I did, there'd be hell to pay. That night, I didn't sleep, my thoughts spun relentlessly, Rachel's words looping over and over. Someone in our group. I stared at the ceiling, replaying conversations, interactions, stolen glances I might have missed. By morning, I had a short list of suspects. At the top was Brian. Brian and I had been best friends since college, the kind of guy you trust with your life. But as I pieced together moments I hadn't thought twice about before, things started clicking into place. His constant advice to give Vanessa space, the way he'd always defended her even when I vented about our arguments, and those lingering glances when he thought no one was watching. But if Brian was the one, I knew he'd slip up, eventually. Phone buzzed with a text from Olivia. Need to talk to you. Coffee. Same place as yesterday, 2 p.m. I replied with a simple yes, grateful for her perceptive nature. If anyone could help me navigate this mess, it was her. That weekend, our group met up for a barbecue at Chris's place. The smell of burgers and charcoal filled the air as charcoal. People trickled in, carrying half-hearted contributions, bags of chips, 6-packs of beer. Conversations and laughter buzzed around me, but I wasn't there to enjoy myself. I was there to watch. At first, Brian and Vanessa didn't do anything suspicious. They didn't sit together, didn't exchange any overt signals. But as the day wore on, small things began to stand out. The way their eyes avoided each other when they thought I was looking. How Vanessa laughed just a little too hard, e.t. Brian's jokes, the brief touch on her arm as he walked by. They were careful, but not careful enough. I wasn't the only one who noticed. Rachel was there too. And every time Brian and Vanessa interacted, her face twisted with guilt. Caught me staring at her at one point, quickly looked away. That sealed it for me. She knew more than she'd admitted. Olivia sidled up next to me at the drink table, her voice low. You're right to be suspicious, she murmured, pretending to choose a beverage. I've been watching them for the past hour, the way they're avoiding each other. Classic guilty behavior. I nodded slightly, grateful for the confirmation. I need to be sure, I whispered back. I'll help you, she promised. But be careful, keeping my voice low so no one else would hear. You're going to tell me the truth, Rachel, right now. Her hand shook as she poured a soda, her knuckles white. Mason, I've already told you everything. Don't lie to me. I cut her off, my voice hard enough to make her flinch. It's Brian, isn't it? Her eyes darted around, checking to see if anyone was close enough to overhear. Then with a tiny, reluctant nod, she whispered, yes, it's Brian. I felt my chest tighten as anger grew to life. My best friend, the guy I trusted with everything, the guy who had stood by me through every rough patch in my marriage, and he was sleeping with my wife. Why didn't you tell me before? I hissed, my voice barely above a whisper. Rachel looked like she might cry. I didn't want to blow everything up. Vanessa begged me not to say anything, and I thought, my baby, she'd ended on her own. My jaw clenched as I struggled to keep my voice even. And you've just been sitting on this, watching them stab me in the back. Her face crumpled and she whispered, I'm sorry, Mason. I didn't know what to do. Stay out of it now, I snapped. You've done enough. The rest of the barbecue passed in a blur. I kept my distance from Brian and Vanessa, but every time I saw them, every shared smile, every casual glance, the anger simmered just below the surface. I wanted to confront them, to lay it all out right then and there. But this wasn't the time or place. I needed to think. I needed a plan. By the time we got home, I was exhausted, but my thoughts were sharper than ever. Vanessa walked in a few minutes after me, humming softly like nothing was wrong. The sound turned my stomach. Did you have fun? She asked, tossing her purse onto the counter. Yeah, I said, forcing a smile. Good to see everyone again. She kissed my cheek and headed to the bedroom, humming to herself as she went. The truth, but I wasn't ready. Not yet, not without proof, not without a way to make them both pay for what they'd done. As I stood in the kitchen staring at the spot where her purse sat, an idea struck me. Slowly, deliberately, I walked over and opened it. Inside, I found her phone. The phone was locked, of course, but I'd known Vanessa's passcode for years. My hands trembled as I keyed it in, the screen unlocking to a flood of her private world. I scrolled through her messages, my heart pounding with each swipe. Most of them were harmless. Texts from co-workers, reminders from her mom, updates from friends. But then I saw his name, Brian. My stomach churned as I tapped on the thread. There it was, spelled out in plain black and white. Flirtatious exchanges, plans to meet in secret, professions of love. The words blurred as I read message after message, each one cutting deeper than the last. The most recent conversation confirmed they'd been together just 2 days ago, on a night when Vanessa had claimed she was working late. The betrayal hit me like a freight train, the weight of it nearly knocking me out of my chair. But instead of crumbling, I felt something dark take root inside me. This wasn't just about being hurt anymore. This was about justice, revenge. For the next few days, I played my part perfectly. Vanessa didn't have the faintest idea that I'd uncovered the truth. She carried on as if everything was normal, smiling, laughing, even curling up next to me in bed at night. Every touch, every kiss felt like venom. But I forced myself to endure it. Brian was no different. He still joked with me in our group chat, still wore the mask of my best friend. Sheer audacity made my blood boil. But I stayed calm. I'd waited this long. I could wait a little longer. Olivia called me during my lunch break. I've been thinking about your situation, she said without preamble. You need to expose them in a way they didn't deny or explain away. Something public, but controlled. I'm all ears, I replied, grateful for her strategic mind. What about that camping trip everyone's been talking about? She suggested. Remote location. All your friends as witnesses, nowhere for them to run when you dropped the bomb. The idea came to me while staring at their messages for the 100th time. I needed to expose them in a way they couldn't deny. In front of the people they cared about most. A camping trip. It was perfect. Remote, intimate, and with plenty of witnesses. They'd have nowhere to hide once I laid it all out. The group had been talking about a camping trip for months, so it wasn't hard to step up and take the lead in organizing it. Everyone was thrilled, especially Brian. He even offered to help plan it. which I found almost laughable. If only he knew what I was planning. I reached out to Rachel separately. She hesitated at first, but after some convincing, okay, a lot, she agreed to help. She even sent me photos she'd secretly taken of Vanessa and Brian together. I didn't ask why she had them or what had compelled her to keep them. It didn't matter. I had all the proof I needed. Are you sure about this? She asked over the phone one night, her voice shaking. I'm sure, I replied, my tone ice cold. They don't get to walk away from this unscathed. She sighed, clearly weighed down by guilt. But I didn't care. She'd been part of their betrayal, whether she wanted to admit it or not. Helping me now was the least she could do. The trip was set for the following weekend. We chose a remote campsite about an hour outside of town, far enough away that there'd be no interruptions. When I told Vanessa about it, her eyes lit up with excitement. It'll be so great to spend time with everyone, she said, completely oblivious. If only she knew what I had planned. The week leading up to the trip was torture. Every night, I lay next to her, my anger bubbling beneath the surface as she drifted off to sleep. Every laugh, every touch, every stolen glance at her phone was another twist of the knife, but I reminded myself to stay focused. Just a few more days. On the morning of the trip, I packed the car with all the essentials: tents, sleeping bags, coolers, and one very specific folder. Inside were screenshots of their messages and the photos Rachel had given me. I wouldn't need it until the time was right, but having it with me felt like carrying a loaded weapon. Vanessa and I drove together, chatting idly as if everything were fine. At one point, she reached over and held my hand, her thumb brushing against my knuckles in a gesture that once would have been comforting. Now it made my skin crawl. I forced a smile, playing along. She had no idea she was walking straight into her own undoing. When we arrived, Brian was already there, unloading gear from his truck. He greeted me with his usual grin and a hearty slap on the back. Ready for a great weekend? He asked, his voice full of enthusiasm. Always, I replied evenly, keeping my tone steady. He didn't have a clue what was coming. Over the next hour, the rest of the group arrived, and the campsite came alive with activity. Tents went up, coolers were unpacked, and the smell of grilling meat filled the air. On the surface, it looked like any other weekend with friends, but beneath it all, I was watching, waiting. Every interaction between Vanessa and Brian felt like a slap in the face. Vanessa was a master of deception, laughing and joking with everyone as if nothing were wrong. She even stole glances at me, her smile warm and familiar, lingering a little too long. It was subtle, but not subtle enough. Olivia caught my eye across the campfire and gave me a small, encouraging nod. She positioned herself strategically, ready to back me up when the moment came. The rest of the evening passed in a haze of barely contained rage. As the group gathered around the campfire, the flames casting long shadows against the trees, I knew the moment was near. My chest tightened with anticipation. This wasn't going to be pretty, but it was long overdue. They'd fooled me for too long. Tonight, the truth would finally come out, and there'd be no escaping it. The air hung heavy with the smell of smoke and roasted marshmallows, but I couldn't taste mine. My focus was fixed on Vanessa and Brian. Though they sat on opposite sides of the fire, their stolen glances carried a weight, a silent shared language I couldn't unsee. My stomach churned every time their eyes met. Around us, everyone else was relaxed, swapping stories and laughing easily. Vanessa played her part perfectly, leaning into me every so often, her hand brushing my knee like she still had any right to touch me. Brian, on the other hand, was restless. His nervous energy showed in the way his eyes darted around, like he was waiting for something to go wrong. He wasn't wrong. I waited until the conversation began to slow, the laughter trailing off into the comfortable quiet that follows too much food and beer. Perfect. I stood, brushing the crumbs from my hands and letting my gaze sweep over the group. All right, I said, my voice cutting through the stillness. I've got a question for everyone, a little thought experiment. A few heads turned my way, curiosity lighting their faces. Brian shifted uneasily in his seat. Vanessa's brow furrowed as she looked at me, clearly confused. What kind of question is that? Chris asked, leaning forward. I smiled, but it wasn't a friendly one. What would you do if you found out someone you trusted, someone close to you, was stabbing you in the back? The atmosphere shifted instantly. The warmth around the fire evaporated, replaced by an uncomfortable tension. People exchanged uneasy glances, unsure whether I was joking. What kind of question is that? Vanessa asked, forcing a laugh that sounded hollow. Mason, come on, that's a little dark for a camping trip. Might be, I said with a shrug, my gaze locking onto hers. But it's been on my mind a lot. Betrayal, lies, you know. The things that destroy relationships. Her face paled, and Brian's hand tightened on his beer can. He looked like he wanted to disappear. The rest of the group stayed frozen, the growing storm clearly visible, though its source remained unclear to most of them. Mason, Rachel's voice broke the silence, soft and full of warning. I ignored her. You know what's amazing? I continued, pacing slowly around the fire. How easy it is for people to hide things. They'll smile right to your face while twisting a knife into your back. It's impressive, really, but the truth always comes out in the end. Brian cleared his throat, his voice unsteady. All right, man, we get it. My bit. It's time to move on. No, my voice snapped like a whip as I turned to him, eyes locked on his. I don't think I'm done yet. The group was dead silent now, the weight of my words pressing down on everyone. Reaching into my backpack, I pulled out the folder I brought. My hands were steady as I flipped it open and held up the first set of papers. These, I said, my voice sharp, are text between Vanessa and Brian. Gasp rippled through the group. Brian shot to his feet, his face pale. What the hell is this? He demanded, his voice cracking. Sit down, I said, cold and commanding. He hesitated, his mouth opening to protest, but the look I gave him made him drop back into his seat. Vanessa sat frozen, her wide eyes locked on the papers in my hand. Mason, she stammered, her voice shaking. I can explain. Don't. My tone was low. Deadly. You've lied enough. Now it's time everyone knows the truth. I stepped closer to the fire, holding up the messages for everyone to see. This isn't just a few flirty texts, I said, my voice rising. This is months of lies, months of sneaking around, making me look like a fool. And it's all right here. The silence was deafening as I let the papers drop to the ground, scattering as I let the papers drop to the ground. Them in the flickering firelight. Then I pulled out my phone, opened the photos Rachel had sent me, and turned the screen toward the group. The image of Vanessa and Brian caught in an intimate moment filled the air with an audible shockwave. Olivia stood up, her voice clear and firm. I've seen it too, she announced, adding weight to my accusations. I've been carrying on behind Mason's back for months. It's disgusting. The campfire erupted into chaos. Feet yelling at Brian. Rachel buried her face in her hands. Vanessa started sobbing, tears streaming down her face as she reached for me. Mason, please, she cried. Don't do this, please. I turned to her, my voice cold and unrelenting. You did this, Vanessa. You and Brian. You ruined everything. Brian tried to speak, his hands raised as if to defend himself, but I silenced him with a glare that made him shrink back into his chair. Don't, I spat. You don't get to explain. You don't get to justify it. You're a liar. Both of you. I stepped back, my eyes scanning the faces around the fire. Some looked stunned, others angry. A few just seemed heartbroken. I didn't care. This wasn't about them. It was about exposing the truth and watching the two of them squirm. Without another word, I turned and walked away from the fire, leaving the chaos behind me. Vanessa's sobs and Brian's frantic attempts at damage control faded into the night as I moved farther from the group. I didn't stop until I was deep in the woods, where the only sounds were the rustling trees and my own steady breathing. The next morning, I drove home, alone, leaving the campsite and the wreckage of their lives behind me. The quiet hum of the engine was the only sound as I replayed the scene in my head. Vanessa's tear-streaked face, Brian stumbling over his words, his mask finally slipping, the gasps of our so-called friends. When I got home, I walked inside without hesitation. The house felt empty, stripped of the trust and warmth it once held. The walls seemed to echo with the memories of a life I no longer recognized. I walked seemed to echo with the memories of a life I no longer recognized. Straight to the bedroom, grabbed my suitcase, and started packing clothes, essentials, just the things I needed. Not that much felt important anymore. As I zipped the suitcase, my eyes caught on the wedding photo sitting on the dresser. For a moment, anger surged in my chest like a wildfire. I grabbed the frame and hurled it into the trash. The shattering of glass was oddly satisfying, a punctuation mark on the end of something that didn't deserve saving. I wasn't staying another saving night in that house. By midday, I'd already spoken to a lawyer. The papers were in motion, and I made it crystal clear that they needed to include every ugly detail of the affair. Vanessa wouldn't walk away with a penny more than she deserved, which was nothing. As I left the office, my phone buzzed with a message from Brian. I hesitated, debating whether to read it. Against my better judgment, curiosity won. His message was a pathetic excuse for an apology. Mason, man, I'm sorry. I never meant for this to happen. Please, let's talk. My grip on the phone tightened as I read the words. Never meant for this to happen. What a joke. He planned it, lied to my face, and now he wanted forgiveness. I deleted the message without replying. He wasn't worth the time it would take to type a response. By that evening, I was settled into a small rental apartment on the other side of town. It wasn't much, just a single bedroom with outdated furniture. But it was quiet. It was mine. And most importantly, it was free of her. Vanessa tried to call that night over and over. Her name flashed on my phone screen. I let every attempt go to voicemail. At first, her messages were soft, tearful confessions that churned my stomach. Then her tone shifted. Desperation crept into her voice, cracking as she begged me to come home. By the last message, her sweetness had curdled into venom. "You're making a mistake, Mason," she hissed. "You're throwing away everything we built over one mistake. You'll regret this." I laughed bitterly as I deleted the messages. The only thing I regretted was ever trusting her in the first place. For my revelations spread like wildfire through our friend group, Chris called to check in. His voice tinged with disbelief. "Man, that camping trip turned into a disaster the second you left. Everyone turned on Brian and Vanessa right away. They tried denying it. But after everything you showed us, they didn't stand a chance." I didn't say much, though the thought of confronting Brian on the spot had crossed my mind more than once. Rachel reached out too. Her voice trembled with guilt as she apologized profusely for her role in everything. "I didn't know what to do," she admitted between sniffles. "I didn't want to hurt you. You knew." I told her flatly, "You knew," and said nothing. "That makes you just as guilty." She started to cry, but I hung up before she could drag me into her guilt spiral. I didn't have the energy for it. My focus was on cutting ties, clearing out the rot that had infected my life. Olivia was the only one I welcomed. Came over with takeout and a bottle of whiskey, offering solid companionship without judgment. "You did what you had to do," she said simply. "Now focus on healing." Brian tried to contact me again, but I blocked his number. Vanessa didn't bother calling after her first round of attempts, and I figured she was too busy dealing with the fallout of her choices. When the divorce papers were couriered to her, I imagined the shock on her face as she read the detailed list of grievances. Part of me wanted to confront her one last time, to make her admit everything face to face, but I realized it didn't matter anymore. I had the truth, the evidence, and the upper hand. She had nothing. The silence that followed was a relief. It gave me the space I needed to think, to process, and to plan my next steps. By the end of the week, I started reconnecting with people who truly mattered. Kevin, a loyal friend from college, reached out after hearing their news. We grabbed beers at a local bar, and for the first time in weeks, I felt like myself again. "Forget them, man," Kevin said, clinking his glass against mine. "You're better off without all that drama." He was right. I didn't need Vanessa or Brian or anyone else who didn't value loyalty. What I needed was to rebuild, to focus on the people who actually had my back. As I sipped my beer and listened to Kevin talk about his latest project, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Peace. The day the divorce was finalized, I stood outside the courthouse, the papers in my hand. The morning air was crisp, cutting clean through me, but I didn't feel weighed down anymore. The last ties to Vanessa were severed, her betrayal reduced to a footnote in a legal document. For the first time in weeks, I felt truly free. I folded the papers and slipped them into my jacket pocket, just as my phone buzzed. It was Chris. "Saw the news. Congrats on ditching her. Drinks tonight." I smirked and typed back a quick reply. "You bet." There was something cathartic about closing that chapter so completely. Vanessa had tried one last time to fight the terms of the divorce, her lawyer suggesting mediation, but the mountain of the divorce evidence I provided left her with no leg to stand on. She walked away with nothing, just her guilt and a reputation in tatters. The fallout from the camping trip sent shockwaves through our friend group, and Brian was the first casualty. He was shunned almost immediately. No one wanted to associate with the guy who betrayed his best friend. Chris mentioned that Brian had tried to salvage his reputation by spinning some sob story about how he and Vanessa had fallen in love. But no one was buying it. Words spread fast, and not just among our circle. I heard through the grapevine that Brian lost his job shortly after everything came to light. Apparently, sleeping with your best friend's wife doesn't win you many allies in the workplace. I didn't feel sorry for him. He made his bed. Vanessa wasn't doing much better. Her social circle, once built on brunches and group outings, dissolved almost overnight. People pulled away, invitations dried up, and she found herself on the outside looking in. Her entire life had revolved around being part of a community that valued loyalty, and now she had none. As for me, I sold the house. I couldn't stand being surrounded by the ghosts of a life that had been nothing but a lie. The proceeds went towards starting fresh, a new apartment, simple but comfortable, in a part of town far enough from the old neighborhood that I didn't have to worry about running into either of them. Moving felt like turning a page, like stepping out of the wreckage and into something clean and untainted. I unpacked slowly, taking my time to decide where everything should go. It wasn't just about arranging furniture. It felt like I was putting pieces of myself back together. The apartment wasn't much, but it was mine. No ghosts, no lies. Subscribe and stay one step ahead of cheaters. And trust me, the next story makes this one look like a fairy tale.